I'm out of here at midnight, by the way. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult to cover in that time what I want to cover, and you will already know that there is no absolute solutions to the problems we've got in politics in Australia and in particular in New South Wales. But nevertheless, through this session will come some ideas. I want to remind people in Bateman's Bay and Bega, Moss Vale and Shoalhaven, please give me the information on whether any current elected members of council or state or federal government have attended any of these sessions, and please let me know if any council servants have attended any of these lessons, any of these lectures. I don't need to explain why. First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for being in this lecture series. It's the most important lecture series that I've ever participated in, and it is the beginning of a huge change in New South Wales. If you think that's a big statement, then I hope that by the end of the session we can justify that. You have had presentations from some of the top activists in Australia, and from each one of those we have learnt lessons. We have already known that we live in possibly the most corrupt state in Australia. If you needed any reinforcement in that, then John Mant, who was at one time acting ICAC Commissioner, said this: New South Wales and Queensland are at the bottom of the scale of the least corrupt states. And there's always a reason, so peel the onion. New South Wales ICAC has completely failed for Wollongong to happen. ICAC didn't break the long-standing corruption of the planning system in New South Wales, and so on and so on. Now, I took very, very detailed notes of what John Mant said. Coming from that source, to me, from a public official of his standing, was quite riveting, and I will use that in months to come. Within this room, there will be candidates for local council, and within the rooms in the campuses, satellite campuses, there will be candidates for council, and there will be candidates for state government. If that's not the case, I'm out of here. I want you to feel your power as individuals. I want you to feel that at this stage, and there are still a number of important presentations to come, you know more about the failings in the system, and most importantly, you know more about the attitudinal and structural changes that have to be made and the corruption of process that has allowed our state to become one of the most corrupt in Australia. Therefore, you are better equipped than possibly 98% of the general population, and you are better equipped than probably 90% of your elected representatives, if you've got the will to do something about it. Don't believe you can't do it. You're looking at a person who was extraordinarily nervous and knees shaking when I first addressed my very small meeting in a small village. I have seen, and I can name people that have come through the ranks from being very nervous, self-effacing, people without much confidence, who are now in their face, in the face of the administration. And of course, you have activists in this room who've made that journey, and not the least of which are the Port Kembla copper smelter terrorists. So you can and you must, because it's no good saying somebody else has got to do it. I'm going to go through some of the ways that we can achieve this dramatic change. You, I hope, at the end of this session, and at sessions which I hope to run further down the line, and how in heaven's name we're going to organise it I don't know yet, we'll have the methodology, the attitudes and the values to be an elected representative, or to be in a very strong supporting role of your elected representatives, and be in a strong position to support the courageous people in the public employ who speak out and don't get the support that they very, very seriously deserve. It never ceases to amaze me that in my career you can count on the fingers of one hand the people who will write to your newspaper in your defence, who will take up the cudgels on your behalf when you're making a point that nobody wants to know about. Now, if you do nothing else, that's your job, and you must do it. Because it's a thankless job, being an elected member of Parliament or a council, if you're serious about community engagement, anti-corruption, proper process, honesty and integrity. When we talk about how you achieve this change, I'm going to talk about the general structural matters that are mentioned in the course. And just to get through each of these headings would take me many hours. But the content is important, and I'll read them. Creating social harmony. How problems arising in the community can be solved by the community. Attaining goals with a common purpose. Dispute resolution and dealing with conflict. Allies, enemies, contact, compromise, neutralisation, understanding, respect, the power of knowledge and information, attitude and determination, integrity and honesty, resourcefulness, campaigns by individuals or groups, the role of information technology, it's all there in your notes, the role of information technology, tapping public servant networks, developing public support for supportive public servants, and that's extremely important. I addressed a meeting of over 600 people just prior to the last local government elections in Shoalhaven in Ulladulla, and I stressed that you people are unhappy with council. If there are whistleblowers within the council administration, if there are people that are doing the right thing, if there are people who are nobbled because they're doing the right thing, you as their employers must speak out in their defence. And you must cane the General Manager, and you must cane the Mayor and the councillors if they do not join you in the defence of honesty and integrity. Strategies for becoming an effective activist but remaining safe from litigation or intimidation. Networks, using the media. I want to mention here that I ran into Richard Moorcroft, who I know reasonably well, and he lives he says he lives at Wollongong near Huskisson, and he resides in Sydney. But he's down our way a lot, and he offered, just off the top of his head, he said, I'm quite willing to get involved and to talk with people on how to use the media, which is his specialty, of course. Innovating and using people power and community teamwork. Knowing the boundaries of action, that's important. And just while I think of it, I can think of activists in this community who do not know the bounds of activism and who do not know that activism is one step, not the total process. Because the total process is solutions. And the total process is positive working towards solutions. And that's harmony, that's compromise, that's working together. Now, so you will run into activists in organisations And that's all they ever do. Ask them, as the media doesn't ask many of our elected representatives, okay, Mr Abbott, what's your solution? What were you going to do? Oh, well, we're not going to tell you because we're going to wait till the next election, and just before the next election we're going to announce our policy. Sorry, not interested. Knowing when to apologise. Now that's a difficult thing, and I've been in that situation a number of times. You cannot be an activist unless you do have to apologise. You get it wrong, and sometimes you do somebody harm and you have to eat humble pie, and it's not easy. Do it, get it over with, and get on with it. Admit your mistakes, knowing when to shut up. Managing confrontation with dignity is extraordinarily important because it's so easy to lose it, particularly when you're under pressure, particularly when you've put in months of work. When you're tired and when you're stressed and you're fed up, you have to remember that dignity. Identifying the soft underbelly. What is going to tell? How am I going to make it tell in what I'm doing? In other words, the weaknesses in the system you are confronting. The use of deputations is the next heading. Public meetings, facts, persuasion rather than force, knowing the law and how to be careful. We are now at 5 to 12 if we try and go through all that tonight. So I want to then go from there to look at some of the ways that you can do things. So we've got the yin and the yang. Unfortunately, you have to get involved in the yang. I am two people. I'm a typical Gemini. I am a soft person. I can be brought to tears. I have very strong emotional feelings. I paint. I play clarinet. I write poetry. And I've got to get in their face, and I've got to get in front, step out at question time and move an urgency motion, and that's stepping out of the trenches in World War I, where the press gallery's full, all the ministerial staff are there, the Parliament's chock-a-block, and the public gallery is full, and as soon as you stand up and say, Mr Speaker, I wish to move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would preclude the following motion, immediate consideration of the following motion, you're out there in no man's land. So courage and faith in yourself. If you haven't got it, you can develop it. You can develop it by experience. And you can develop it by preserving your own integrity and your dignity. So look at me. I occupy no position at all. I'm not anything special. I'm able, however, to have an effect in the media, still, at 75 years of age, is it? I don't know, 76 or 75, I don't know. But, I have to work that out. But why is that so? Because I tell the truth. Because what I say comes from the heart. And because I've shown by my actions over a lifetime cast iron integrity. That doesn't mean that I'm Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean I haven't cheated at times. Doesn't mean I haven't lied at times. But generally speaking, I'm a person of integrity. And that means that if you're a person of integrity, you're a person of influence. I remember Jack Ferguson, Deputy Premier of New South Wales, somebody really attacking him, and he stood up and you could have heard a pin drop because he was a man of integrity. He had his feet on the ground. I remember in the parliamentary dining room where he turned around to some young member sitting at the table, whinging about the food. He said, listen, mate, it beats the Christ out of sandwiches in the brick pit. He's got that grassroots toughness, which we all have when the crunch comes. You know, the people who've stood up are the people you least suspect, in my experience, of standing up. The apologetic ones, the quiet ones. But if it comes to the crunch, they come through. That's my experience. The loudmouths, the would-bes, the could-bes, the egos, they abandon you. And I fear weakness more than I fear corruption and dishonesty. So on the yin side, we're going to try and create social harmony. And this is the technique that I think that we ought to adopt in the coming state and local government elections. I don't give a damn who you are, whether you're Liberal, Labor, Independent, doesn't matter. I don't care whether you're pro-gun, anti-gun, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, whatever you are, I couldn't care less. What, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to combine together in Wollongong or in Nowra or in Maitlands Bay or Moss Vale or Tweed Heads, we're going to combine together on process. We are going to have a 10 commandments which we want to sign up ourselves to as candidates, and whether they're Labor, Liberal, Independent or National Party or whatever, we want you to sign up to, because we've been dudded so many times. We're not copying it anymore. So I'm looking at the path of citizen-written legislation. When you see some of the mugs and the shonks and the thieves who write legislation, we can do better. And they give you a pretending Freedom of Information Act with all the holes and exclusions in the world, right? Anybody like a dance? Okay. You see, we can unite the people of Wollongong and the people of throughout New South Wales, and that's going to be my job this year. My job is to work out the 10 commandments, the basic legislation that we want these people to sign up by statutory declaration to, because no matter what their ideology is, no matter what their goals are, we have the right to know, we have the right to participate, we have the right to free speech. We have the right to justice and liberty and a fair go. We have a right to a fair tendering system. And this is where you appeal to the business community. I thought Monica Broney did the job very well on Monday when somebody asked her about, okay, you're talking about citizen involvement, where does business fit in? What was her answer? Business fits in because if you have an engaged community, if you have a community that takes ownership of itself, you have a safe community, you have a good environment to bring up your family, and you have a good environment in which to do business, and you have a level playing field is what I'm talking about, so that people who get in Tripodi's ear, or people who get in Obeid's ear, or somebody else's ear, doesn't steal the march on you and you don't even get into the tendering process. We want a tendering process like in North Sydney, for example, when Ted Mack was mayor, where in fact the tender box was sealed with signatures, and when it was opened publicly and the public were invited, and as the tenders came out of the box they were pinned up on a notice board for everybody to see, competitors and all, and then everybody knew where they were at. Now that's the sort of environment that has disappeared. It's disappeared at the state and federal level across Australia. The open tendering process for procurement of government services to government, of materials to government, of contracts for government have disappeared. It's an amazing situation. It's an amazing situation. So we will attain social harmony by identifying the goals of an open, accountable society. In doing that, of course, you will get many cynics, and so you have to be prepared, and that's partly my job and a job of a team of people that I'd like to put together so that we can give you the basic reference points as to what you are talking about. Now, when I first stood as an independent, I didn't have much idea, except that I thought the local member was corrupt and that there was a problem over the Shoalhaven water to Shoalhaven, access to waters of the Shoalhaven for the Shoalhaven Shire, of which I was Deputy President at the time. And I went home to Vera and said, I'm going to stand against this bloke. And of course she thought I was absolutely nuts, and she's been right every time, of course. But I had to develop these strategies and ways of surviving. You will get a big jump start on where I was then. You already have. And one of the things that I remember an old wise head in the Labor Party, used to be Minister for Public Works, a bloke called Ryan, he talked to me about neutralisation, because one of the things they did was they circulated a dummy security file on me saying I was a communist and, you know, rah, 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 during the Cold War. And he said, well, one way you can handle that, he said, is go up and talk to them. He said, if you're able to pin down where that rumour comes from, go and knock on their door and say, look, I want to talk to you about, I want to meet you, I want to talk with you about your problem with me. You'll be amazed, except for the real hardheads, and there's plenty of them around, what a difference that makes. Suddenly you're a person. Suddenly you're not in their face, you're not going to punch their nose or anything, but you just want to say, look, I just want to discuss this with you. I think there's a misunderstanding here. Now, you'd be amazed at how many times that doesn't happen. This warfare goes on through letters, through the newspapers and so on. Now, you can't talk to everybody. So you've got to pick your mark. It's called neutralisation. Understanding, respect for other people's point of view. That's probably the greatest failing, I think, in the whole system of justice, is that we all want to jail the rapist for life. We all want to put the thieves away. We all want to hang the murderer. And we can't really not punish people, but we do not look at where that person has come from, what their life experience is, and how that life experience has affected their behaviour. And consequently, what I'm talking about here is an attitude, not you going out trying to solve all these social problems, but the attitude. The attitude is, what's in this guy's mind? What's in this woman's mind? What is their code of reference? Where are they coming from? Try and understand. Be the devil's advocate. Now, maybe they've got a point here. Maybe they've got a point. Maybe I'm wrong. And start the conversation in that respect, in the newspaper or whatever. So that understanding and respect for another person's point of view will win you a lot of friends. It'll win you a lot of friends. And you go to a lot of trouble to do that. I remember Vera and I stopping on the edge of Badalla. Now, Badalla is a small town, as you know, on the far south coast, where 70 or 80% of the people voted Liberal, and we're up there trying to sell ourselves as an independent candidate. And I felt very intimidated, and Vera was scared. A person of extraordinary courage, comes from a conservative background. At least I had half a dozen brothers and a couple of sisters to fight with. And I thought, well, what do? You know, the only thing you can do is to do it. Go knocking on doors saying, I'm John Hatton, I'm an independent candidate, you know, I just want the opportunity to meet you, and so on. And that personal contact, that door knock, is really, really the most effective method of campaigning. Now, you hand a sheet of paper out that says, who is Billy the Kid? You're Billy the Kid, you're standing for Parliament, who's Billy the Kid? You give them a few basic facts, okay. Now, what happens when you give somebody a document face to face is that they'd like you to read it. If they pick it up their letterbox, it's that, and that, if you're lucky. So what you have on the front page and on the back page is really important. And if you're lucky, they might turn over the middle page and have a look at that. So the design of the document is extremely important. The simplicity and honesty of the message is extremely important. I'll come back to that in campaigning. You really have to be determined. Now, what's determination about in politics? It's about context. all of us who are sensitive people, when you're under fire, even if it's only a letter to the editor, it hits you there and it hits your family. Right. It takes you some years to get to the stage where you can step out of yourself and look at that in context. And that's what you've got to learn to do. Where's this person coming from? Think maybe they've got a point. That softens the blow a bit. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe I'm learning something from it. But even if they're being very personal, think of the positive thing. Remember I said in an earlier discussion, I say to young activists, if you're not being criticised, you're not doing anything. If you're being criticised, you're starting to make an impression. If you're being rubbished, you're really going places. And the more strategic the target, the heavier the flak. Now, you can console yourself with that quite a lot. If you're drawing a lot of flak, provided you can evaluate what you're saying and you've got sincerely in your heart that it's in the public good, then that will stand you in good stead. The other thing I wanted to get across in this, when we're talking the personal side of it, when things get you down, and I have been in tears many times, when things get you down, try and step out of the problem and look at it, remember me saying, as if it were a mathematical problem. In other words, as if it was happening to somebody else. And that's difficult, but it's very important. It's important because it helps you evaluate, but it's more important for your own physical and mental health and energy levels, because these things are designed to take your energy, and you must not let them do that. Now, resourcefulness is something where you've got to try and think outside of the box. And I'm talking about television, that's bad enough. But how am I going to get this message across? How am I going to encapsulate this so that it grabs somebody's attention without trivialising it? Now, that's extraordinarily difficult. Some people have the art of doing it and some people don't. I wasn't going to tell this story, but I better, I suppose, because it involves this university. I've told it to the people in Shoalhaven on the quiet. But I had a serious dispute with the University of Wollongong because of the treatment of Dr. Ray Cleary, who had pioneered the Shoalhaven campuses and the idea of satellite campuses, who had, by his sheer tenacity, driven this off Wollongong campus program forward. When his contract came up for renewal, it wasn't renewed. He was devastated. That was just after the new Shoalhaven building had been built. I was angry about that. Another little lesson here. The enemy of my enemy is my ally. You've heard that said many times. That's true. If there's one person who is not an enemy, because I don't think in terms of enemy, but who I'm constantly attacking, it's the former Mayor of Shoalhaven. But on this issue, we're united. Doesn't matter about past conflicts. Doesn't matter about what I think of him as a person or what he thinks of me as a person. We both come here to Wollongong. We want to see the Vice-Chancellor. We want to know why Ray Cleary's contract wasn't renewed, why he wasn't the right person, look at the work he's put in, and so on and so on and so on. Now, I don't want to go into all that. Okay, wasn't renewed, we lost the battle, Ray Cleary died of cancer. My view is he died of a broken heart. 700 people turned up at his funeral. A professor from this university, help me out here, the late political science, Jim Hagan. Jim Hagan was at the funeral representing the university, and I was there obviously. We're walking towards the car park, and I said to him, you know, Professor Hagan, this place is going to be called the Ray Cleary Campus. And he stopped and he said, what? I said, this is going to be called the Ray Cleary Campus. He said, you can't do that. He said, it's got to go before the Senate of the university and it's got to be proper. I said, no, it's not. It's going to be called the Ray Cleary Campus. He said, oh. I said, well, I'll tell you what. I've spoken to Pat Campion, who's a sign writer, and she's prepared to write the sign for nothing. And I have Jervis Bay Welding. They're going to weld up a steel sign. I've got my brother's truck, and I've got Dad's army to put it up. And he was bloody gobsmacked. He was gobsmacked. He said, you can't do that. I said, listen, mate, the ratepayers of Shoalhaven put in $5 million towards this. The Aboriginal people gave the land. Ray Cleary gave his life for this university campus, and it's going to be called the Ray Cleary Campus. Anyway, I said, we're going to put up this sign. I said, it's going to be a media event. And when you pull it down, it's going to be another media event. And when we put it up again, it's going to be another media event. And he goes, he was a bit gobsmacked boiled. Anyway, within a week, I had also spoken with Ray Cleary's widow, Zete, who I know well. And I don't know whether I rang her or she rang me, and she said, they're going to call the administrative building the Dr. Cleary building. I said, well, that's good. What do you think? She said, I said, are you satisfied? She said, yeah. I said, okay, well, we'll leave it at that, won't we? At the commemoration, when they put the plaque on the building and so on, a big fellow, John, I won't tell you his name, secretary of the Shoalhaven Combined Unions, walks down the corridor and he's big booming his voice and he says, well, John, today we come in peace, mate, don't we? You see what I'm saying? People like yourselves may not know what power you've got. This community belongs to you. These assets belong to you. Your street, your neighbourhood belongs to you. And you're going to defend it. And you're going to work out ways to defend it in a way that's going to grab attention or bring about a result. And of course you're going to go through the usual procedures like deputation and letters to the editor and maybe, if you're lucky enough to get an appearance on television and so on. But you're also going to try and work out a strategy, whether you send a council a brick to the new building, that each week you dump a brick at the council or something and says, okay, that's the first brick of the building we're looking for in Warilla. This is the second brick, and so on, whatever it is. You've got to be resourceful, and it's got to be a positive thing, not a negative thing. And there are plenty of creative people in the community that can give you all sorts of good ideas on that. Well, the one that WAC did about carrying the coffin in front of Parliament House about the death of democracy in New South Wales wasn't a bad one. So, identify your allies, as well as neutralising your enemies. Identify your allies and supporters. Now, sometimes that means widening your message. Give you an example. At the moment there's a Donnybrook going on in Shoalhaven about council wanting to flog off the Nowra pool in favour of a major sporting complex in Bomaderry, the two towns, right? Obviously there's warfare over that. I don't see it as a fight for the pool. This is where you've got to broaden your thinking. I'm not going to get involved in local fights anymore. I want to try and stop the people who are lighting the fires. But what about that pool? It happens to be on the beautiful Shoalhaven River, just across the bridge, the gateway to Nowra. That's how I see that. So instead of me talking to all the people who want to train in the pool and the people who've got a historical association, I'm talking now, if I was running this campaign, I'm talking now to Shoalhaven. This is the gateway to the main town in our city, right? What the hell do you want to sell it off for? Even if the pool doesn't stay open, it's public space. It's a beautiful public asset right alongside of the river. And so your campaign is not the pool, it's the space, it's the beauty of the city, it's the wider engagement of the wider community. Now, try and develop that, because you can be too focused. you want to save this bit of creek, or you want to do this, you want to do that. Look at the wider focus here and see if you can engage people. And if necessary, change your plans to include some of those groups within your community. So you will widen your allies and your supporters, and you'll try and neutralise your opponents. If you're going to get in their face, which you've got to, of course, you do it with dignity. And we've talked about that before, and that is, go right up to them and ask them the question. If you meet them in the street, if it's the mayor or it's the town planner or somebody, then you employ them and ask them straight out and say, look, I just want a few minutes about it. What is your reason for this? You know, I'm entitled to know. Now, John Hatton pointed that out. The unfairness of the whole council process. And this is a key point I picked up out of his speech. He said the problem with councils and with Parliament is that they behave like Parliament. Now think about that. What does Parliament do? It doesn't get all the facts. It doesn't have an independent arbiter. It doesn't allow you to present your case. It has no basic components of justice. So how in heaven's name can a council consider a development application in that environment? What chance have you got if you're on the wrong end of that development? You've got no chance at all. You don't get a chance to put your case. Oh yeah, well, okay, any questions? Oh, well, you've got 5 minutes. This is the arrogance of the council meeting. Oh, well, you're the general public. Sure, you elected us, but you've got 5 minutes, you know. Oh, well, now your mayor will interrupt and say, well, I'm sorry, you'd have to sit down now, your 5 minutes is over. No consultation as to how that 4-storey building is going to completely wreck your solar system in my own village. I wasn't there this night, but I tell you what, I wish I had been, where the city services manager, I think it was, a woman had just built a new house, put solar panels on the roof, and he was announcing a 4-storey building alongside of her. And when she protested, he said, oh, well, stiff cheese, you shouldn't have bought there. I mean, the arrogance of that man, the sheer arrogance of it. So when you decide to get in their face, let's look at some of the headings. First of all, dignity and manners. Now, Jack Beale, who was my first opponent, he was the Minister for Conservation, whenever he visited the South Coast electorate, whenever he visited the Shoalhaven Shire, of which I was Deputy President and later President, I always gave him full honours. Welcomed him as the Minister, thanked him for coming, invited him to speak. Always. Manners and dignity. And what have you got up your sleeve? Knowledge. And Tony Vinson is going to talk more about this. Knowledge. You have to do your homework. And if not all of the points agree with your platform, too bad. You have to acknowledge that there are some points on the other side. Carefulness in preparation is extremely important. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because you will be more amazed. You will not be as amazed as I am if you are really computer literate, which I'm not. What you can find out about this and that. Okay, I'm at a public meeting, 300 people in my own village of Huskisson. This bloke comes up to me after the meeting, never met him before. He said, look, Mr. Hatton, I want to talk to you about some matters. He just amazed me. Now, what he had done, just as an ordinary citizen, he wasn't standing for council or anything, what he had done, he had, first of all, he'd gone to the Electoral Funding Authority He'd gone through the records, he'd found out who contributed to the Mayor and the Mayor's independence, so-called independence team. He had then gone online and he tracked where each of these people, what companies there were that that they were involved in. He went to the rates records online, the ownership of properties. He knew exactly where the properties were, what the zoning was, and what these people had to gain. He then went to the approvals, the DA applications, and he tracked all of those development applications and approvals. And what happened was we ended up with a 43-page report which showed these are the major contributors to the mayoral and his team's campaign. These are the non-conforming development application approvals, and guess what? They fitted like a glove. That's power. That's power. Because you couldn't shake that. You can't shake that. All I'm saying to you is that if you start off, and I was speaking to a student on Monday who's doing a research project which I won't discuss, but we talked about this. Where do you start? You start at the most basic and logical thing. Okay, is that person a resident here? Where does that person come from? How much I can find out about them? You know, did they contribute? Now, in order to do that, you have to go to school in a way, because you have to find out what resources are out there, like court records, ombudsman. I'm not going to, you can't take all these down. Maybe I should give you something in writing on this. Court records, ombudsman and ICAC reports, Auditor General if it's got some relevance, if you're looking at a state government matter. You look at council records and so on, as I've explained, without going through them. Newspaper reports can be handy, even though they're often inaccurate. On the one side then, you need to look at what is your resource base in your research. The other side of it is, what are the supposed watchdogs in our community? And this is what Michael Kirby was saying to me. He's a bit worried about calling it community empowerment, because being a person, as a homosexual, a member of a minority group, then obviously he's worried about community empowerment and all the bad things that can go with community empowerment as they punish people for racial reasons or for sexual preference reasons or for any other reason, with prejudice, religion or whatever. If I don't come back to that, please remind me. That's very important. I'm going to come back to that because I want to talk about communitarianism as opposed to parochialism. So remind me to come back to that. So you will need your own little resource base, which you can get online. What does the Equal Opportunity Tribunal do? What does the Anti-Discrimination Board do? Not a big thing, but 5 or 6 points. What does the Auditor General do? The Ombudsman do? What are the rules governing whether ICAC ought to get involved? Right. I spent a lot of time last time, and I won't go through it again, on what can my local member do for me? What can my local councillor do for me? Are they going to stand up and they're going to ask a question in the Parliament? Are they going to put a question on notice? Are they going to make an adjournment speech? If necessary, are they going to move a no confidence motion? Are they going to move a suspension of standing orders in the Parliament and a censure motion? Doesn't matter if you're on your own. Numerous times in the early days before they changed the standing orders, I would sit on one side of the Parliament and the whole of the Parliament's on the other side because they called a division. So John Hatton sitting there and there's not enough seats to fit the rest of the people in on the other side, and they don't like that one little bit. They don't like that one little... I didn't like it one little bit either. But you've just got to have that faith in yourself. And remember I said to you about MPs and councillors, particularly, and this doesn't apply to Eurobodalla and Winchia Kirby and Shoalhaven and Bega Valley councils, but it does apply to Shell Harbour and it does apply to Wollongong, where you've got political parties involved. Don't get caught up in the games. Listen, mate, that's your problem. I raised it in the party room. Look, I don't give a damn whether you raised it in the party room or not. It's not of interest to me. I want you to raise it in Parliament. That's what I put you there for, mate. I want you to raise it on the floor of council. That's what you're there for, right? Don't tell me that the caucus wouldn't agree with you. Don't tell me it's not party policy. Don't tell me this, don't tell me that. I don't want excuses. You're either going to do the job for me as my elected representative if you're not, and if you're not, I'm going to tell the public in the best way I possibly can through letters to the newspaper or radio interviews, talkback sessions, whatever's available to me, I'm going to let them know that you're not prepared to do this for me. Okay? Even if I'm in the minority. That hurts. Believe me, they pretend not to take notice, but they take notice. They take notice. You've got to be proactive. And in doing that, you've got to look after yourself. Now, Harry Evans, unfortunately, can't come, the clerk of the Senate. Maybe we could get him back at some other time because he wrote that wonderful paper on Parliament, the unreformable institution, which I've got a copy of. I want to put some basic testaments, using the biblical terms, some basic testaments on the web that would help. But in his place, we hope to get, through Glenn, we hope to get a person who's retired as a defamation lawyer for the Sydney Morning Herald. And so we can actually ask him questions. Now, I've been through defamation twice. I mentioned this before and I don't need to go over it again. It's an awful process. It's designed to shut you up. It's designed to intimidate you. It's designed to prevent free speech. And it does. It's the greatest ally of corruption, and that's one of the pillars that I want to change. I want to change the defamation law so that in the Supreme Court ruling in Canada recently, there was a landmark decision where to the effect it said that privilege, and I'll read it to you. I hope. It's Richard Ackland. You can look up the Richard Ackland, who often writes a very good legal column. It's in the Herald of Friday, January the 1st this year. And this is what he says. The judgment of the Chief Justice Beverley McLaughlin, this is in Canada, writing for 8 of the 9 judges, reads like a journalist's dream. Quote, while the law should provide redress for baseless attacks on reputation, defamation lawsuits, real or threatened, should not be a weapon by which the wealthy and the privileged stifle the information and debate essential to a free society. That's where I'm heading. They can stand up in Parliament and they can call you a pedophile, they can do what the hell they like to you, and there's nothing you can do about it because they got absolute privilege. And I've used that absolute privilege to good effect on many occasions myself. But you make a statement about your local member and they're seeking a swimming pool out of you, and their legal fees are paid for by the government, particularly if they're ministers. It's totally unacceptable. So what Ackland then goes on to say is, can you imagine our High Court judges giving a backhander to the wealthy and the privileged? Now that's where I'd like to see a defamation law written to which we ask candidates to sign up so that you and I can speak freely in our society. In Sweden, for example, defamation is not unheard of, defamation lawsuits, but they're not common. And they're not common because there's no huge payout and because they recognise freedom of speech. And in Sweden, the freedom of information legislation goes back 300 300 years. 300 years. There's a difference in Sweden in that if you're dead, you can still claim an action for defamation, or your relatives can still claim an action for defamation. In Australia, the minute you die, they can tell anybody they like what they like about you. That's good and bad. It was good in the case of Askin. Might be bad in my case, I don't know. I would again point you to that Churchill Fellowship report that's in the library here that I wrote and which is now on disc. And I get given the disc to Glenn, in which you can, it's like a Bible, in which you can look up these things on the court system, on the power of the Ombudsman, on defamation, freedom of speech for public servants. All of these things which I want to put into law and sign people up to. So where are we going? We're going into process. If you're prepared to stand for Parliament, I don't care what your view is, but I want to say, and I want free speech, and I want the people I employ as public servants to have the right of free speech, and I want to make it, as in Sweden, an offence in law to interfere with the rightful, proper and efficient performance of duty by a public servant. In other words, you can't do a Howard. You can't say, I'm sorry, but you're not going before a parliamentary committee. We're not going to allow you to be cross-examined on the children overboard. Right? Parliament must be supreme. And as Sylvia Hale said in that inquiry into the McGurk matter and where the guy was murdered, she said to this person, well, you involved in the murder? And the bloody roof fell in. I was on her side. I don't care if, of course it's a tough question. But okay, the person's there in a public forum with all the media present to answer that. And I have a perfect right to ask that as a Member of Parliament, and I'm going to ask it. And it's nonsense for the chairman to rule it out of order or the chairperson to rule it out of order. We've talked about preparing to eat humble pie, about admitting when you're wrong, and about persuasion. I want to talk a little bit about defamation. You cannot, for example, say you're a liar. You can say, that is a lie. Safe. You can express an opinion, but that opinion, and I should do the disclaimer here, which everybody's got to do these days. That is, I am not a trained lawyer. I do not know anything about defamation. Please don't take any notice of what I'm going to say. Go and see your lawyer. Right, now we've cleared all that up and I'll give you my opinion. You cannot say you're a liar. You can say, that is a lie. You can make a strong statement of person, but don't impinge their character. Stick to the guts or the subject, as it were, of where you're going. And the other cast iron rule is you must not impugn improper motives. Right? You can say, as far as I understand it, you can say, well, isn't it a fact, Ms. Hay, that you did receive a loan of $60,000, right? And that came from a developer. Safe. The minute you say that there may be some connection between the way you have acted and the receipt of that money or that loan, or the impugning that the developer may have some hidden agenda, or that you as a Member of Parliament's got some hidden agenda, you're in trouble. You can't do that, and you must stay away from that. So you can say basic factual things, but if you're going to do that, you must also put the counter case. Now, you will see time after time, once you learn to read these things, and you may already know, I'm not telling you how to suck eggs. I'm talking to a wide audience here. You'll learn to read newspapers in a particular way, and that is, you will see when there's a difficult road that the newspaper reporter's got to follow, that they will say the newspaper doesn't impute any improper motives. We have no evidence to say that XYZ is a crook or whatever. They don't say it like that, but that's what they mean. We have given the opportunity for the person who's been criticised to get involved. Sometimes, and quite often they don't, they choose not to. They choose not to. Now, as the famous case of Kerry Packer and the Goanna insinuation that arose out of the Costigan Royal Commission, and Costigan, in my view, was right. I think Packer was a crook, and I think Packer did get involved, and he was drawing connections. But in the newspaper report, they tried to get some of this stuff out, and they used the word Goanna instead of Packer. And Packer then identified himself as Goanna and took them on, and won. So even though you don't name them, if there's sufficient information in that article to identify the person to a logical, normal reading by an informed citizen, you're in trouble. So really you have to walk very carefully. If you're going to get yourself into this difficult area, then that's when you put the acid on your Member of Parliament. I want you to do something about this. And you look for ways, if you can, to get the matter in a privileged form. Now, court reports are privileged. You probably understand that. You can take a piece out of a court transcript and you can report it. Even though the court transcript says this person's a pedophile, you can say it. But you have to put a balanced report of the court report. You can't just pick and choose, can't cherry pick. But that's a privileged document. What a person says in Parliament is privileged. What a person asks in Parliament is privileged, right? What a quirk in the law is, which Rosemary Foote got caught out very badly by Brereton on, is even though you said it in Parliament, you can't stand up in a camera outside of the Parliament and say it again. You're the only person who can't do that. Now that's crazy, but that's the law. I'm a Member of Parliament, I say Joe Blow's a crook, right? I step out of the Parliament, somebody shoves a microphone in my face and says, you say Joe Blow's a crook. You're in trouble. That's what happened to me on the 11:30, on the 11 a.m. report, live television. You say, last night the member for South Coast tipped a bucket on former Premier Robert Askin, former Police Commissioner Hanson, former Police Commissioner Wood, former Police Commissioner and so on. And they list all these people that I'd tipped a big bucket on the night before. And then he turns around and he says, you say these people are corrupt. I'm gone. My advice was, even if I say nothing, I did not take the opportunity to clear their names. By silence has acknowledged what was said. Now, really, when you get to that stage in our society, you've got no democracy at all. Now, whether that would work in court, I don't know. I had the option of walking off live television or standing up, and I said yes. Copped the writ straight away from Farquhar, Chief Stipendiary Magistrate, and from Askin. And it worried the hell out of us. You're talking to somebody now who owns nothing. It's all in my wife's name. I don't own anything. That's not necessarily waterproof either, but it's a lesson learned. It's a lesson learned. So you're wanting your Member of Parliament to do that, okay? Of course, court action, forget about the justice bit, doesn't happen. Anyway, very seldom. So you have to learn to look after yourselves. There's a number of basic rules. I can't go any further than that. Don't say they're a liar. Say that's a lie, and I can show that that's a lie. And and you might even go so far as saying, I believe you know that's a lie, but you can't say you're a liar, because that means that you lie all the time, which they probably do. but then you've got to get up and prove that they lie all the time. Now, the trouble with the defamation process is that they serve you a statement of claim. That statement of claim says that last night at XYZ you said this. Then the interrogatories start. They hire a lawyer. This is where this Supreme Court ruling in Canada is so important. They've got the money. They've got the firepower. They hire the lawyer, right? And the lawyer then sends you all these technical questions. And if you're silly enough to answer them without you hiring a lawyer, you're getting yourself further and further into the mire. And so this question and answer interrogatories, they call them, go on. And it can cost you tens of thousands of dollars even before you get into the court. And then, of course, in Australian context, here you've got locally in Shell Harbour, where a woman, and it wasn't defamation, but it's an indication, where a woman broke the confidentiality of the council by revealing the general manager's pay packet. Cost her $100,000 in court fees to try and defend herself. I mean, what sort of nonsense is that? Why aren't all these salaries up there for us to see them? It's out of our pockets, for God's sake. And how can a council declare such a thing confidential? Another, go back to John Mant, when he said about codes of conduct. Codes of conduct, quote, have gone mad. Pages and pages on not how to be a crook. And yet, great stories put on them. Okay. Now we get to the yang bit. This is where you get in their face. The fact is you've got to remove the control freaks. The fact is you've got to remove the crooks. You've got to expose people for what they are. Now, with defamation, that's difficult. I've already given you one weapon, yes, you probably already knew anyway, and that is the importance of in-depth research. Then try and get a civic reporter from the Sydney Morning Herald, preferably, but there may be Telegraph or somebody else, who is prepared to take the story on. They have the legal backup. They will get that story legal. They will get some of that information out if it's got a good public interest story to it. And so consequently your research can go places. It can go to an independent member of Parliament. It can go to a member of the upper house. It can go to a question in the House. It can go to a statement in the House. Right? So you have to be resourceful. I want to speak about two things: qualified privilege and absolute privilege. Absolute privilege is where in the courtroom and in the Parliament you can say what you like and it can be reported and you can't be sued. That's absolute privilege. No conditions. It's interesting that they've got the freedom of speech and we haven't. Outside the courtroom you can argue public interest, and I want you to ask, and I'll probably be asking myself anyway, I want to clarify these points with this fellow if he turns up. Outside of Parliament, you can talk about qualified privilege. Now, qualified privilege, very loosely, knowing that I'm not a lawyer, is you have a right and a responsibility to convey the information to a person who has the right and responsibility and the obligation to accept that information. That needs to be thought about, right? So you are informing your counsellor of a matter that by virtue of his or her office, he has an obligation or a right to know, and you have an obligation and a right to convey it. It doesn't safeguard you from action, but it's what they call qualified privilege. Now, qualified privilege exists in a number of forums which are not covered by absolute privilege, and one of those forums is council meetings. So, a councillor can be sued for saying certain things in a public forum, but they do have that defence of qualified privilege available to them. Now, I can't go into the technicalities of how you're going to argue that, but it's important to know that it does exist. And then, of course, there's the truth and public benefit defence. Truth and public benefit defence. Now, as anyone that's ever been through a courtroom knows, that truth and justice has got nothing to do with courtrooms. Absolutely nothing to do with courtrooms at all. Now, we mentioned the important thing about not being sidetracked. Cut loose from the game playing. If it starts to get away from where you're going, bring it back. Get right down to the basic principles. What am I trying to do here? What's the point I'm making? And more importantly, what is the public interest to be served by the point that I'm making? If you're then getting away from that, you're letting your ego and your personality and your other emotional involvement carry you where you don't really want to go. If you're really in the game for the public good and the public purpose, it must come back to that all the time. All the time. And it's so easy for somebody to say you're a rotten, stinking so-and-so and so-and-so, and you get involved in all that. Forget about that defence. If somebody attacks you personally, you bring it right back and say, oh, well, he might very easily be right, or she might very easily be right, I might be all of these things, but what's the answer to this? See? What did you do about this? Why did you tell a lie here? Never, never overlook where you started. Where you started. Because you can get involved in defending yourself and you're not going anywhere. And that's exactly what they want to do. That's the name of the game. Sidelining. I talked about their games to do with party politics. That's their problem. Not interested in caucus, not in pre-selection, not interested in anything. Something I asked you, I then want to talk about teamwork. If any of you are going to stand for council, and I am suggesting to you now that you can revolutionise this city on the knowledge that you've got, and same and when I say you, I mean Bega, I mean Shoalhaven, I mean Eurobodalla, I mean Wingecarribee. I'm not just talking to the audience in front of me. If you've got this basic approach about inclusion and communitarianism, which I'll come back to in a moment, then you're going to need support, and you're going to have to build up that support. I could not have done what I did in Parliament without having volunteers in my office, people who turned up at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon and who worked for nothing. I couldn't have done it if I didn't have a support base within the community. I couldn't have done it if I didn't build up that support base. Now, how did we do that? Getting groups to work together. This is networking. Now, I'm speaking from experience and I'm repeating what I said earlier on to emphasise the point. In each of the local government areas that I'm addressing now, you have a multiplicity of organisations, right, all competing for resources and oxygen. Your local member, if they're doing the job, should bring those people together for discussions as to how they can work better together, how they can share resources, how they can make their community a happier and healthier and safer place to live in. And you are the catalyst. And this is the exciting part about the job I'm asking some of you to take on. You can be the catalyst. In other words, you don't go in because you're elected and say, I'm God Almighty and now I know where I'm going and this is what you're going to get, so sit up, fold your arms and shut up and this is what's going to happen. Education, education, education. Where's that coming from? As Aeschylus said in 25 BC, what knows more than all of us, than any of us is all of us. And you feed on your community and you bring them together and you get them to talk with each other. Now I mentioned, for example, Bega, where they were competing for resources. from what was then a new fund that was set up under the Wren government, grant money for sporting organisations. Said, right, I will as a local member call all the local sporting groups together, hockey, football, whatever it is, netball, bring them all together. Let's talk about how we can combine together to get the best amount of money we can out of the state government. And what did they do? They formed the Bega Sports Council or interagency or whatever, right? And you form the group and you talk about maybe we can concentrate on that field and share it. Maybe it's your turn this year and our turn next year, right? But we're going to get behind each other and we're going to try and help each other. We're going to try and work together. And that networking can extend because each of those people have their own little world. They know people that you don't know. And if you get them on board, they'll get the people they know on board. And maybe her husband's brother works for council. You can get some information that way. If you get information that way, look after the public servant. Don't dob them in. You see, the important thing is never quote them. Never quote them, right? Because it's not the source, it's the information. If the information is right, you don't have to dob them in at all. You don't have to say, oh, well, the chief engineer said this to me, as an aside. If, of course, you have to say the chief engineer said this to me because they're playing their games, well, that's fair enough. But if somebody's trying to do you a favour, look after them. And that'll pay great dividends in the long run. And networking will give you this wider experience to draw on. I talked about being the devil's advocate. Now, I had a little group in Parliament around me. The fellow I chose for my research officer, Arthur King, his basic philosophy, political philosophy, was anarchy. Now, anarchy is not what it's been, and we've got an expert on anarchy here, by the way, in hands, and so he'll probably correct me, I'd say, but the basic philosophy was wrongly painted during the 19th century in particular as being bomb-throwing, activists who were out of control, anti-community people, anti-government people. It's a basic philosophy which I had to sum up in one line. It says, I don't believe in systems because systems serve systems. They don't serve people.
No God, no master.
No God, no master. Okay, now, having that guy alongside of me when we met with cabinet officers, ministers, minders, spin doctors and all, was just he'd turn around and say, that's bullshit. Straight to their face, that's bullshit. And this is why it is bullshit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It just brings things right down to earth. A little story. Goanna wanted to set up, had a great idea. He was, of course, on about privatising public services flat out. Strongly opposed by the Labor Party, who are doing exactly the same thing now. He had this great idea that he was going to set up 100mm corridors, that's about 4 inches, that'll link Orange, Bathurst, Griffith, Newcastle, Sydney, the main centres, particularly where there were decentralised government offices. And he was going to save the state a fortune because he was going to have his own little private telecommunications network. They drew up the legislation. Chikarovsky came to see us as the independents, holding the balance of power, and gave us all with the minders, gave us all this wonderful story. And Arthur turned around and said, have you asked the Commonwealth about this? And they said, no. He said, you don't think that the Commonwealth is going to let you take over this huge lucrative market that they own? You're telling me you haven't even consulted them and you've drawn up this legislation? Never came before Parliament. And something as simple as that had been entirely up there, so involved in this wonderful idea, they'd forgotten about the basics. Now, the number of times that happens in health, in transport, in a whole range of things that you and I know about every day. Okay, so Arthur was an anarchist, and this is where the big problem is, as I mentioned earlier in a previous lecture. Ministers have people around them that they feel they want, not who they need. To give them the advice they want, not the advice they need. And so this whole industry that has grown up of contract public servants, and I mentioned before about a local government leader who used to walk in amongst the council officers, which he's really not allowed to do, and interfere with the administration underneath the general manager. And he'd get jobs done, and he'd say to them, don't forget, when your contract comes up, we've got the numbers on the staff committee. See? That's how it's operating. And that's how it operates with ministerial advisors and senior appointments. Are we off for time? Running out now. Yep, okay. What time we got to knock off? Oh, right, I better stop. So, I'll leave it at that because I've been talking continuously for a huge... Oh, there's a couple made another point, I think. Gut feeling. If it doesn't feel right, take notice. If your motives are sincere, if you're not bound up with your own ego, and you're really going into this for what you sincerely believe is a public purpose, listen to your gut. And listen to your partner. Those two things have been invaluable to me. Try to develop 360-degree vision. Detachment. In other words, put the message, the criticism in context. A problem is not necessarily your problem. In Wollongong, in each of the satellite areas, across New South Wales, we can stand independent candidates. We can ask political party candidates to sign up to these basic rights and not give a damn where they're going, as long as they give us the power to get involved. And I think we can change things. Thank you very much.
Did you cover that additional item you meant to come back to?
Yes, that was the communitarianism. There was a wonderful paper written by a professor of Copenhagen University who gets into a bit of obtuse language like some professors do and people in universities and that sort of stuff. But of course Glenn's the exception and Stephen's an exception. But when you get to the guts of it, why did Obama succeed? Because Obama got under the radar. The radar of the major political groups don't think about community from the community point of view. What he was saying is, you can and you must get involved, and my job is trying to facilitate how you can get involved and bring about change. Now that's referred to as communitarianism. Now, communitarianism is not parochialism. It's not being a vigilante, which are the most dangerous phase of community empowerment. We're going to run those homosexuals out of town. We're going to round up these thieves. We're going to teach the Aborigines a lesson. That's the ugly face of community empowerment. That's got nothing to do with this school at all. What this school is about is, how can we, as a community, work together as a community in as much harmony as we can create within the system of democracy of Australia in ways which will strengthen that democracy and make it more accountable. That's the guts of it. Okay, your turn. I will not take any defamation action whatsoever.
May I say something to add to my credo as an anarchist?
Yeah, well, you have to ask. It's got to be short according to the boss here. Go on, go for it, Hans. Microphone.
My credo as an anarchist, apart from no God or master, is cooperation and mutual aid. That's all.
Cooperation and mutualisation?
Mutual aid.
And neutral. Yeah, neutral. Mutual aid. Cooperation and mutual aid. Not a bad credo, is it? Not bad. Right, okay. Nobody said how do you get rid of the bastards yet. That's what I thought was the next. I thought that would be the first question. I'm saying to you that we have a wonderful opportunity and you can. I'd like to see 2 or 3 candidates stand, at least 2 or 3 in each of the seats within the viewing area here, from Bega north, right? Exchanging preferences and demanding from their opponents what they're prepared to sign up to themselves. That is, these 10 commandments of accountability, which we've yet to work out with the legislation. There is an opportunity here to bring about a balance of power. I really believe that. Now, you were first, Jill. No?
John, just tell me that. Let's start with somebody else first, though. Just talk me about selection of candidates.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I'd love you to speak a word about how would you select out those who are in for election for their own power only? What are the indicators for a true and honest and integrous group of people that we can honestly put our support behind? So far, my witness is that there's a lot of people out there who are really keen to promote themselves and not the community, and will try to keep and show terrible disrespect all other people in that process. And that makes me really angry. And I'd love to know what indicators could it possibly be in your experience to identify truly communal, spiritual-minded people.
Right, now this was a question that didn't get a chance to be asked by my friend up the back here at Monica Brony's session. First of all, if they're activists in the community and they haven't got a positive agenda, forget them. Because they're activists, because they're egotists. That's very, very important. How many times in the Australian society I see people say, by geez, that bloke's a good counsellor, you know, he's really stirring people up, he's got the big wooden spoon. But what is that person's positive agenda? Criticise, promote. If they don't promote, forget them. I don't care how high profile they are, how they come across as being good people, they will dud you. They will dud you because they're egotists. And given the opportunity, they'll sell you down the drain. That's personal experience here, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to rely to some extent on what they're doing. Now, what we did in the Shoalhaven Combined Progress Associations when we were trying to stand candidates on a non-party political, non-sectarian basis, and I was president, we asked people to give a 5-minute address and then we used to cross-examine them, as it were. But that came from a point where they had been in the organisation for some time and we knew a bit about what they were doing in their village of Kalala or Sussex Inlet or Ulladulla or wherever they happened to come from. So you really have to look at what their past record is. And if their past record is one of activism only, forget them, right? Of course, they're control freaks. I can't give you an answer because Ted Mack and I have been dudded several times to the extent that he will not ever endorse a candidate unless he really knows them. Now, if they're fugitives from a political party and not truly independents, be careful. Because if you get a balance of power, then obviously they're going to sell you out. They're going to take the ministership that's offered. They're going to take the Speaker's chair. They're going to take the Assistant Minister's job. They're going to take the preferment that's offered to them. Where you go from there, I'm not really sure. But there is a technique that will help. Safety in numbers. In other words, just don't back one, or try not to get just one independent candidate for the seat of Keira or the seat of Bega or whatever. See if you can line up 3 or 4. They may be of different viewpoints, but provided they will sign up to this document and embarrass the opposition into doing the same. It's like everything else. It's a matter of your judgment. I can't do better than that. Bega, have we got any questions from Bega? Or Shoalhaven? Or Moss Vale?
John, we've got 2 questions. Sorry. It's Moss Vale here. I don't know whether we've got through first. Moss Vale?
Can you sort this out, Ben? Right, who? No. Moss Vale, good.
Okay, Moss Vale, we've got 2 questions here, and
good.
They can both be quick.
John, do you have any idea why they still haven't got the Freedom Information Commissioner? Why candidates haven't been accepted, or why that's been stalled?
So that's the first question, John. And the second question, if you could also get that in to speak.
Okay. The first one, why hasn't the government appointed a Freedom of Information Commissioner? I don't know. I suspect it's because they don't want one. Secondly, one of the things that I emphasised in the past, and I'll quickly do it again, the biggest failure in the system is that the watchdogs that we expect to look after us against the overreaching of government or council are appointed by that council or that government, and so we want to change, as part of our 10 Commandments, the way Auditor-Generals, Freedom of Information Commissioners, ICAC Commissioners, Police Commissioners and so on are appointed. They've got to be appointed by a bipartisan, truly bipartisan process. Freedom of information legislation, have a look at the work that's being done. Well, first of all, on the website there's a October 2007 paper that I wrote, and in that it refers to FOI, and in that it refers to a comment by I think he's a professor in Tasmania who's specialised in freedom of information, says that the level of freedom of information in Australia at that time, which I think was about 2008, was worse than China in many respects. In other words, there's so many exclusions, and I'm just trying to, certificates or whatever they call them, which let the government off the hook. Very quickly, public servant contracts must contain as sackable offences 2 provisions: the failure to facilitate and support whistleblowing, and the failure to facilitate and support freedom of information. If you make that a sackable offence for contract public servants, you'll revolutionise the public service.
Thank you, John. And our second question is...
John, it's Dan Richards here. I knew you when I was reporting at Four Corners, and we spoke in 2007 during local elections in Kirby, because I'm now working at a local independent paper. My question relates to the role of local press. Sometimes if there's only one paper, you
can be captured by vested interests of the advertisers, and that can stifle independent reporting. However, things can change dramatically, particularly if you have journalists of independence and integrity, and a paper that is willing to stand up. I'm just interested in your response to that. I have a second follow-up here, which is also to do with good public governance. There is often a confusion between incompetence and actual corruption. And your gut feeling that something's wrong may actually only lead you to the fact that the processes are being governed sloppily because of incompetence.
Yeah, that second point is very important, because you can step into a bear trap to do with defamation because you've assumed that because there's a stuff up, it's corrupt. So you really have to allow for the fact that it could be a stuff up. Secondly, as far as independent reporting is concerned, without reference to your local newspaper there, I'm aware of your independent newspaper, and I've read some editions. It's very important if you can get community news sheets going. It's almost impossible to do so, because unless you're getting some revenue to support a full-time or at least even a part-time staff, you just can't do it. You can't get the distribution, you can't get the actual physical stuff on paper and all the things that go with it. As far as direction of newspapers are concerned, there's no doubt that it varies greatly from editor to editor, and I know that from the South Coast without singling out any editor between Mossvale and Eden. I know that's a fact. Where one person is out there really wanting to change society and really wanting to expose, the other person is hiding, either because it's not their style, that's fair enough, or because they're worried about whether they will lose major advertising supporters. The fact is that it's bad news for your newspaper, perhaps, the Independent, but the fact is, as everybody knows, newspaper circulation is dropping, and it's dropping because of IT. And I didn't get around to the power that we now have available to each of us on IT to communicate across a wide area, a wide spectrum of the community. Get back to your Independent paper. I hope that there will always be businesses out there, particularly small businesses, who will see the wisdom of the fact that the planning regime supports shopping monopolies, as was put by John Mant, and to their detriment. It's also important to get the message across to small business that, in fact, if councils are influenced by large business, it's bad news for small business, so small business ought to be supporting an independent voice. Last point I will make, and this is not helping you very much, I understand that, I don't think I have any answers. In Sweden in 1989, when I was there, they had a policy of government support of the dissenting voice, as they called it. And that's a pretty progressive attitude, where the government would support, just to keep that section of the media alive, the dissenting voice, whether they agreed with it or not. Now, one of the major problems in small local government areas, as well as large local government areas, is that council advertising is an important part of the local revenue. You can work out the rest of that equation. Shoalhaven, yep. Shoalhaven, could we go to Shoalhaven now? Sorry. Here we go.
Hello, John. This is Marie from Shoalhaven. My question is about council meetings and qualified privilege. Can you tell me, does this apply to the general public if they're at a meeting? The qualified privilege. If they have a question to ask the councillors, are they also covered by this or not?
The person speaking within the council chamber, is that person covered by qualified privilege? Is that the question?
I'm talking about the general public here, a general public member of the public rather than a councillor.
Yeah, that's right. A person who's a member of... Yep. The answer to that comes back to what I said. No imputation, no attack on character, a genuine public interest reason and basis on which the question is asked, and the chances are that in the forum you'll be covered by qualified privilege. My advice to you is don't take the risk. Ask a blunt question, but stay away from the areas where you may impugn a person's reputation by saying, in an implied sense, that this councillor behaved this way because he was in the pocket of a developer or she was in the pocket of a developer. You have to stick strictly to the clinical, public nature of the question. Otherwise, you're in real dangerous territory. You would not, in my view, be as covered as the councillor, him or herself. That's my view, but I may be wrong.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, next, Shoalhaven. Bateman's Bay.
John?
Yep.
Hi. When do you think you might have the draft of your 10 commandments, and when you've created them, where will you publish them so we can all see them?
I have to wonder whether I'm going to publish them on a John Hatton website or not. At the moment, that's where I'm leaning. To use my name to try and get out of the ruck, as it were, and to make it very specific. Because if this tour of New South Wales works, then I'm hoping to get fairly wide coverage across the state, and therefore people will be Googling for the name John Hatton. It then gets me out of the area of any reflection on the university, for example, or any other organisation. And I alone then will be taking the responsibility for what is being said and using my reputation. Now, as to timing, I'm hoping that we would have that up by June. I'd like to engage, for example, I've spoken to Luke McNamara, the Dean of Law here, about if your students were framing freedom of information legislation, how would they write it? Wouldn't be a bad exercise. If your students were framing freedom of speech for public servants and protection of whistleblowers, how would you frame that legislation? That would be a very good practical exercise for students to be involved in. I'd like to get John Mant, who crafted the Local Government Act and therefore has a lot of drafting skill, to be involved in some of these questions. I'd like to involve Tony Vinson, for example. So putting these busy people together is not going to be easy, but I recognise that we've got to try and get it out of the system in time to get widespread coverage. But I will be enunciating the principles wherever I go, irrespective of whether they're clinically defined in legislation or not.
Just a quick follow-up, if I may, John.
Yes, please.
Good luck with it. Have you got your website actually created?
I had a website, Accountability Australia, which I still own. I'll probably zap that. I really haven't given a thought to that. It comes back to what I said when I met a meeting of people in the Leader of the Opposition's electorate at Karingai. They said, will you lead the charge into a Royal Commission into the planning corruption in New South Wales? And I said, not unless I have the resources. So that's the second arm of the problem. I'm not going to have my lounge room Pitt Street anymore. I promised Vera that I would not do what I'm doing now. And I have to be able to do it effectively. So I'm going to need a secretary at least part-time and hopefully full-time. I'm going to have a research officer, and I'm going to have office facilities out of my house, because I really do stuff up her computer whenever I go near it. And divorces are expensive. But anyway, what I said to those people at Karingai, yes, if you have provided me with the resources. You know, I don't want to be tied up with anybody. So I'm floating an idea in my head called a Community Empowerment Foundation, in which people can join up for, say, $30 a year or something, a modest fee. That will fund a secretariat, but on the clear understanding that that secretariat is not going to get involved in your problem at the beach, your problem of a housing development in Wollongong. I would give advice on method, process, elections, because there's a hell of a lot to understand as to how elections work and how they're fudging them and how you can use that fudge to your own advantage, legally. Right, so I can do that work and I'd love to do it, but I've got to have somebody like I had before. See, a Member of Parliament's in an impossible situation that I was in. Even though I had all this work, I had that much problems and that much resources and that much time. Now, if I could clear all those problems out and I don't have to solve grandmother's meal on wheels problem, and I concentrate on process, and I had an office and I had a good researcher, and I've got one in mind, whether he'll take the job or not, I don't know, and they're entitled to a wage, I'd work for nothing. And I'd be happy to do it. Now that's the answer to the question. And just to set that sort of organisation up, I need an organisation. That's all. Think about it, you might be able to help. Bateman's Bay, thank you, yes, go for it.
Yes, I have a question regarding defamation.
I've got a hearing defect. I have a hearing defect, so I might have to get somebody to repeat the question. Thank you.
I have a question regarding defamation. Is there any active group at the moment working to change legislation?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. It's a lawyer's feast, and so they're not going to change it. It's a weapon in the hands of all public servants whose legal actions are funded, and all elected representatives whose legal actions are funded, and so consequently these specific interest groups that have the power don't want to change the defamation law. We have to force that change. Sandra?
Just comment on your point about a person coming and addressing the Council through public absence.
Yeah.
And
have you got the thing on?
I think I have. Can you hear me? No. A citizen going through the formal process, applying for public access to address the council, and they make an allegation against the councillor or against the mayor. I think my understanding of this qualified privilege, I think the mayor, or words chairman of the meeting, or the general manager, it's their responsibility then to refer that allegation to ICA.
That's an interesting question. If it's an allegation, yep. My comment is, if the allegation implies corruption or illegal behaviour, or even improper behaviour, if it's improper behaviour, start at the bottom. Then it may be a matter for the conduct committee, right? If it's illegal or criminal behaviour, and that's the allegation, then that person really has to be put on the spot. You either substantiate that. If I were in the chair, I'd say you either substantiate that or you withdraw it. Because if you don't, I have an obligation to warn you that irrespective of my view as mayor, you can be the subject of defamation action by the council or concerned, right? Or the council, and that's an interesting thing. You can defame a defined body of people. It doesn't have to be an individual. So you can defame a council, or you can defame a sporting club, for example. I should have mentioned that. It covers that. You would only, if there is evidence of corrupt or illegal behaviour, then you're obligated to report it to ICAC. If it's an unsubstantiated allegation, my response was, you take that to ICAC and back it up, and then we'll deal with it. That's what my response would be. Other than that, and I'm now on your side, you can't allow people to come to a forum like this and stand up and make unsubstantiated allegations. If they're going to do that, then that's their problem. And you have to make sure that they understand that's their problem. Because let's be fair about this. If you wanted... being a counsellor is a very difficult job. You don't get paid for it. It often doesn't cover your expenses if you're in small business or you're losing days off work, right? So you deserve respect for serving the community. It doesn't say you don't deserve brickbats if you don't serve the community and that you're safe from being involved in a dispute. But remember that those people are there to serve the community. If, of course, they're serving their own private interests and they're involved, well, that's a different ballgame. So they are entitled to that respect. Yes, please. You're positioning yourself. That's my 360 vision.
I wasn't expecting to be asked this, but thanks, John. As a community member, what would be your advice to someone who may be reluctant to act upon a public addressable issue due to not wanting to become like the face of an issue and ongoing public recognition? At what point can you participate and get a message across without going down in history as that person? Can you have one without the other, or is it just part of
I'm not with it. What you're saying is a person who wants to take on an issue publicly, right? Are you then worried about that person leading the charge on that issue, or what's your particular worry there? I'm not catching full meaning.
No, it's okay. I guess, you know, if I graduate at the end of the year and I don't know where I want to go with myself that I'm passionate about, but then, you know, maybe I stand out and say I support whatever. Yeah, whatever. But then 2 years later, maybe I change my tack and I go somewhere else. But I always have that public response. Yeah. Now, I was that person at that moment.
Now, look, I'd say this to everybody, and particularly young people: go for it. Go for it. Step out and have a go. Why is that so? Because you will learn and learn and learn and learn. You will grow and grow and grow and grow, and you will be stronger and stronger and stronger. We all have to start somewhere, with John Hatton shaking at the knees, wanting to get involved in something at a local village meeting, to somebody who can stand up and address a university and have never attended a university in his whole life, right? So that's a part of life's experience. You've got to be, but not only that, at some stage in the future, you may change your mind completely. You might have been pushing Labor principles back there and now you become a Liberal, or vice versa, or don't want to know any of the so-and-sos. That's fine. It's the journey. It's the journey.
If I can just in your experience, do you become pigeonholed as a speaker on a certain issue? Say 1 week you want to push for stopping whaling in Australian waters, but the next week you want to support knocking down a building because it's zoning restrictions and whatnot. Having two different strong point of views, does that ever distract or devalue one or the other argument? Like, can you spread yourself thin, or do you remain?
This is media game playing. It's also media convenience. John Hatton, corruption fighter. Not John Hatton that's interested in community health, where I addressed the Royal College of General Practitioners on community health and the role of the general practitioner. Never ever got reported, right? Not John Hatton that's interested in alternative housing. Not John Hatton that's interested in working with Aboriginal affairs, in management, financial management and accountability of handling government grants. Right. Doesn't get reported. They tend to categorise you as this or that. You have to put up with that, right? But then that's a challenge. You have to show that you can be active and effective in this other area. But it's also the best insurance you've got. Because the worst thing about being categorised is to allow them to make you specialised. Okay? Now, part of your growing as a human being and an active and a political activist is to have that width, because that helps you to evaluate that bit. If you haven't got those bits, you can't evaluate and put that in context. So, my advice to you is go for as many areas as you like. Each one will teach you a different lesson, right? Each one will strengthen you and broaden you. So, if they want to categorise you as something or other, you can't do much about that.
Thank you.
John, you mentioned about 10 back in the tendering process. Speak up. You mentioned about going back in the tendering process and being on public display.
Yeah.
How does that avoid how does that avoid lobbyists or whoever getting to the people who evaluate the tender?
Well, the question was with Ted Mack's open tendering process he had at North Sydney Council, how does that keep the influence of the lobbyists at bay? The way it keeps the lobbyists at bay is that the people whose interests are involved in that particular tender, and say there's 4 or 5 tenderers, they have the opportunity to examine how good their competitive tenders are, right? And therefore they have the ammunition to criticise the council, rightly or wrongly, as to why they made choice A instead of choice C. But it also enables the general public to look at the process, right? And it means that the general public, if they want to, can see if they're getting value for the money. And we'll say then, at the end of that open tendering process, tenderer A, who was given the contract, mucks it up, right? Then you've got all that ammunition. You've got all that knowledge. At the moment, we've got no knowledge. We know that somebody's given the job to do Barangaroo or whatever it is, and we don't even know what the competition is. And the next weapon, they say, is that commercial in confidence. You're going to ask about that. Right. What's the polite word for bovine excreta? That's what commercial in confidence is. It's an excuse to cover up. Now we go back to basic principles. What is it in that tendering process, in that contract, in that preferment, in that supply of goods or services that is groundbreaking, technologically brilliant, and somebody's going to steal it off me? And the answer to that is nothing. There's nothing I know of in local government that I can think of on the top of my head that's going to be groundbreaking that wasn't done at Tweed Heads or Bullabacanka. And they have the hide to say that we're building this bridge in a new way, when in fact they probably stole it from Paris or somewhere if there is a new way of building a bridge, you know. Commercial in confidence at the local government level should not exist. That's my opinion. But there is a way out. At each level of government, as I've suggested in this paper that I wrote, there should be an independent arbiter. In other words, the Auditor General or the Ombudsman should decide the question, but the question should seldom arise if you're fed into it.
It's another supplementary one. What sort of structure do we need or can we put in place to challenge that and have change? And seeing the examples here with Goanna, we should comment on this.
It does. You see, I'm at a disadvantage because even though I was in the Parliament when the Local Government Act was crafted, the new Local Government Act, it's opened up a whole new area which I'm not expertise in. But I think that, and I'd like Sandra to correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Mayor, through the General Manager, must ensure that there are processes in place which ensure openness and accountability. And if that process, when it's brought before the Council, is defective because it hides things from the public that the public are entitled to know, including the competing contractors, the General Manager's got to be put on the spot about that. The General Manager's got to have what I used to say to the people who elected me to the Shoalhaven Council: you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm telling you that now. If you elect me to council, you're not going to tell me what to do. But if I can't give you a solid reason in the public interest why I did it, then you've got every right to belt me over the head. Now that's the, see, we're getting down to simplicity now. It's what you say to your General Manager. I, as the Mayor and our council, want to know what the public interest component was in your making that decision. Right? Put them on the spot.
I actually used to think about the question on this side of the so it's talking about bringing items that in the commercial, the confidential section of the paper into open council.
You're talking about the confidential section.
Yeah, the commercial in confidence, which blocks out all this open tendering process, for example.
Yes, adjudicating process is the new provisions of the Act. With the Wollongong Council meeting, there's often confidential personal details about the business and that provide tenders to council that are often kept in the confidential section of the paper. But under the requirements of the Act, I as Mayor will go into confidential. I actually have to take a formal resolution. The council has to move that they are confidential. And then under the Act, I have to ask those councillors, are there any items in this paper tonight that you feel need to be debated in the open council? Now, councillors have the power to make that decision and move a motion and say on item number 2, which may be the tender for a particular job. I will move that be brought to the council for debate. Now, if that's carried, that's a decision of the council, and that's brought into the open section of the paper to be debated.
Right.
Where there's the presence of the public. Once you do that, if they say, oh no, the decision of the council is that the names are confidential, then there is a formal motion excluding the present public from that, from observing that vote.
Now, the next, see, with all of these processes, it's going to, and this is why it's important that you people get directly involved. It comes down to you, comes down to the General Manager. Before that thing ever is proposed to the council through the Mayor, that be in the confidential section, that person, he or she, has to, in the public interest, have an attitude. And that attitude is, these people who employ me have a right to know. Not because I've been lobbied, not because I think, but it's up to you. If you want me to recommend to council, then you really have to have some very powerful arguments. And it's up to that General Manager not to put his council or her council in that enviable position of making the decision based on what's in the report. Now, that's what one of the things that Ted Mack emphasises. One of the problems with the new Local Government Act is that it gives all the power to the General Manager and all the responsibility and the flack to the elected councillor. So if you get somebody like Rod Oxley, the council gets sacked and he retires on full benefits.